Hello students, this video is being recorded in the summer of 2020, right after the end of the spring semester and in the midst of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. Since we do not yet know for sure what format our classes will take in the fall, and since there's some likelihood that at least some of us, both students and faculty, will have to be away from campus for a time should the mitigation plans prove ineffective, or should compliance with or enforcement of public health guidelines prove impossible, I am preparing a video version of each of my lectures for the class to have it ready if and when it is needed. It's also the case that necessary distancing requirements in the classrooms may make it impossible that the entire class can be in the same room at the same time. In that case, those whose turn it is to stay away from campus may find these video lectures a better option than relying on a live classroom feed via Zoom or some other technology. So if you are watching this video, it means that we are, for reasons of public and personal health, still unable to meet together in a traditional face-to-face classroom format. All the same, I'll continue to do my best to teach you what I know with whatever tools I have at my disposal. Enjoy the lecture.
So now we turn to a very interesting speech by Frederick Douglass, What to the Slave is the 4th of July, given actually on the 5th of July in 1852, because Independence Day that year fell on a Sunday. Douglass spoke before the Rochester Ladies Anti-Slavery Society in Rochester, New York. So Frederick Douglass was born Frederick Bailey as a slave in Maryland in 1817. In 1826, he was sent to work in Baltimore, and there, in violation of the law in Maryland, he was taught to read by his mistress, Mrs. Auld. And one of the books that Douglass read was entitled The Columbian Orator. Now, this book, The Columbian Orator, contained a collection or an anthology of great orations, including a couple that you've already read, the Edmund Burke speech and the Fisher Ames speech. And once Douglass learned to read well enough, he both taught himself how to be an orator and also learned a great deal about abolition and slavery as an issue. In 1833, he was returned to the plantation, and there he had a physical battle, a fight almost to the death, with his overseer, whose name was Covey. And he writes about this in his autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, and says that after that battle, he was at that moment a free man, even if he was still held in slavery. He would never think of himself anymore as a slave. 5 years later, posing as a sailor, he escaped by ship and rail to New York and then later to New Bedford, Massachusetts, where he settled and changed his name to Frederick Douglass so it would be more difficult for his owners or masters to track him down. In 1841, he gave his first public speech at an anti-slavery meeting on the island of Nantucket, and in 1845 published that biography or that autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, which has become now an American classic, something really nobody should graduate from the university without having read. So let's talk a little bit more about Caleb Bingham's Columbian Orator, the book that Douglass acquired while working in Baltimore and as a young man, after he had learned to read. Greg Lampe, who wrote a book on Douglass's early life and career, said that not only did this book offer him his first formal introduction to public speaking, it also deepened his hatred of the peculiar institution, which is slavery, gave him the words to meet pro-slavery arguments, and inspired him to master the art of oratory. So in 1847, Douglass went on to begin publishing an anti-slavery newspaper. First, it was titled The North Star, and it was published in Rochester, New York. Later, it became known as Frederick Douglass's paper. In 1848, he was an attendee at the very first Women's Rights Convention held in Seneca Falls, New York. And 4 years later, while still living in Rochester, delivered the speech that we're studying today, What to the Slave is the 4th of July. In 1861, after the beginning of the Civil War, Douglass made efforts to support the use and enlistment of black troops in the Union Army. In 1871, after the Civil War, he was appointed to a minor diplomatic post by President Ulysses Grant. But of course, it's extraordinary that any African American was appointed to any government post at this period in our history. In 1877, he was made Marshal of the District of Columbia, and in 1889, he was made U.S. Minister or Ambassador to Haiti. Frederick Douglass died in Washington, D.C. on the 20th of February, 1895. So let's think about this 4th of July oration, What to the Slave is the 4th of July, and ask our standard questions. What is the genre of the speech? And then, considering the rhetorical situation, what is the exigence, the audience, and the constraints? Now, the question of genre is an important one because, as we'll see, the article that you've been assigned to read for this speech raises this question directly. We know, for instance, that there was a long tradition going all the way back to 1783 of American communities celebrating Independence Day by requesting an orator, usually a respected person in the community, asking an orator to make a 4th of July oration. You'll recall that Daniel Webster, while he was still a student at Dartmouth, was asked by the citizens of Hanover, New Hampshire, to give the 4th of July oration there in 1801. And so in some ways, Douglass is participating in that long tradition of ceremonial or epideictic oratory. But it's also clear that although he is very familiar with the generic constraints associated with the traditional 4th of July oration, that he uses the opportunity also to make a very powerful argument about the hypocrisy of the American celebration of freedom and liberty at a time when millions of Black Americans are being held as slaves. And so the question of genre, I think, is a complex one. And this certainly is one of the questions that Deacon addresses in her article on the Frederick Douglass speech. So what is the exigence here? If we think about the exigence just in terms of the traditional form of the 4th of July oration, then we can understand that the obligation of the orator is to praise the Founding Fathers and recollect the important developments associated with the American Revolution. And Douglass certainly does some of that. But it's also the case that from Douglass's perspective, the United States of America is in a moral crisis because there are, like he was, millions of American slaves. And so the major exigence for Douglass is to make a statement about the immorality of slavery and to hold America accountable for its continued support of the institution of slavery, even on the day that it celebrates freedom and liberty. So who's the audience for the Douglass speech? Certainly gathered in the hall in Rochester were fellow abolitionists, both men and women, who supported his anti-slavery message and activities. But it's also clear that Douglass has in mind addressing a much wider American public, those who would be perhaps taken aback, surprised, even offended by what he had to say on the occasion of the 4th of July. But as he makes clear in the speech, sometimes it's necessary to shock the nation in order to get them to consider these fundamental moral questions. And so certainly Douglass would have received wider attention from the publication of his oration and circulation of it throughout especially the northern states. And then what are the constraints associated with the Douglass speech? There are certainly constraints, as we've already suggested, connected to the tradition of 4th of July orations. So if we think back to the Daniel Webster eulogy to Adams and Jefferson, we recognize that in that particular kind of an epideictic circumstance, there were very powerful generic constraints. And the 4th of July oration is a similar sort of epideictic tradition. And so Douglass is constrained in some way by those traditions. And he adheres to those constraints in some very clear ways, especially early in the speech. But at the same time, he's also challenging them and undermining them and using them for an opportunity to go beyond what the typical 4th of July oration would do. And then we can think also about how Douglass, as an African American orator, has to speak to a largely white audience in Northern America. And in doing that, then, he wants to express himself and use rhetorical techniques and strategies and language and references that are familiar with that mostly white audience. And so Douglass, in a lot of ways, must embody the expectations that white Americans have for what a good orator should be, should sound like, and should do. So here are some critical questions related to the Douglass speech. In what specific ways does Douglass meet the generic expectations associated with delivery of a 4th of July oration? So as you're reading through the speech, look for those places, especially early in the speech, where Douglass seems to do precisely what his audience would have expected him to do on a 4th of July occasion. But then how does Douglass use his narrative of 1776 as a commentary on 1852? So as we see the anti-slavery argument emerge out of the story of the American Revolution, we see Douglass then using his account or narrative of the American Revolution and the American patriots and the founding fathers. He uses that story as a kind of commentary on what's going on in his own day in 1852. And so then that kind of leads to this third question: how does Douglass both deny and identify with the founding fathers? There are certain ways, especially, I guess, ideologically, that Douglass aligns himself with the founding fathers, but he also makes it clear that the occasion of Independence Day, the occasion of the celebration of the 4th of July, is something for his white audience to enjoy and celebrate, not something that he himself identifies with or can participate in. Here's a couple of more critical questions. Of what importance are the ideas of distance and disparity in understanding Douglass's oration? How do these themes comport with traditional views of persuasion and rhetoric? So you'll see at several different places, Douglass talks about how he feels disconnected from or distant from his audience. But when you think about traditional ideas about rhetoric and persuasion, whether that's something as far back as Aristotle or something much more recent like Kenneth Burke's notion of identification, you're looking for ways in which orators find connections to or similarities with members of their audience. And that source of connection or source of similarity becomes the basis for arguments and appeals to a given audience. But here we find Douglass doing, in fact, quite the opposite. That is, emphasizing the distinction between he as a former slave as an African American, the distance and the disparity, the difference between himself and most members of his audience. And then we could ask, on what different levels or in what ways does Douglass use what he calls scorching irony as the principal trope in his oration? In other words, how is the speech ironic? And several different critics and commentators on the speech have focused on the use of irony in the speech. And it is important, I think, to look at those different occasions where Douglass's remarks are especially intended to be ironic. And so we'll try to point out, at least in a couple of places, where that happens in the speech. Then we could ask, why is Douglass so vivid and graphic in his description of the slave trade? What does this imply about his view of persuasion, and how important are the senses to his description? So we will focus on this particular passage that I'm referring to here, because I think there's something we can learn not only about Douglass's understanding of the necessary strategies of persuasion here, but how his approach actually overlaps and connects to a more general approach toward persuasion that we see among many abolitionists. And then finally, why does Douglass explicitly dismiss logic and argument in the speech? And what does this imply about his recommended standard of judgment? So again, we'll focus on this passage where he talks about whether or not argument is worth anything in this particular debate. And we'll see him suggest an alternative rhetorical strategy. But what does that reveal about how he thinks the issue of slavery should be judged by Americans? So let's take a quick look at this article by Andrea Deacon, and she's writing, and this is one of, by the way, of several very good critical pieces on the Douglass speech. One of the reasons I really like the Douglass speech is it is full of critical possibilities. There's been lots of good articles written on the Douglass speech, but this is a pretty good one because it deals with one of the basic questions that we've enjoyed asking about each of the speeches that we've studied so far, and that is the question of genre. And so, as Deacon points out, she's engaged in reassessing Frederick Douglass, the orator, and begins by talking about this question of genre. And she says, an important first step in reclaiming Douglass's oratory as a meaningful site for rhetorical and cultural critique is to reject its relegation to the realm of mere display or ceremony. Well, in some ways, I don't think that's actually what's happened in history and criticism. I think Douglass is taken more seriously as an orator than she indicates here. But the point here is that we tend to think of Douglass, and especially in this speech, as primarily a ceremonial or epideictic orator. Because Deacon's point is that when we look at what to the slave is the 4th of July, she says we can see that Douglass's public address more accurately reflects a dramatic form of political or deliberate rhetoric, and I think she means here deliberative rhetoric, a rhetoric that deserves to be taken seriously, especially in its formation of a collective identity for African Americans within antebellum America. So the argument here is going to be that indeed, even though it is on an obvious epideictic occasion, it is perhaps more productive to read Douglass's speech as a deliberative address, one that is making a political argument aiming toward a future good or a future community. So we'll keep that in mind as we read through the Douglass speech. There are a couple of other things. Here she goes on to make this argument about why the Douglass speech is not primarily epideictic. In addition to Douglass's ill fit with the ethical dimensions of epideictic discourse, There is another dilemma when considering Aristotle's notion of time in ceremonial rhetoric. In epideictic oratory, not only is there a pre-established affinity between the speaker and the audience, and we've already remarked on how Douglass kind of draws attention to the opposite of his affinity between he and his audience, but the speaker is concerned with the present, since all men praise or blame, according to Aristotle, in view of the state of things existing at the time. And she's making the argument that Douglass is more focused on the future, which puts the address in the deliberative category. In relation to his 4th of July address, it is clear that Douglass is indeed concerned with the present. However, as John Lucades points out, to be an authentic celebration of the 4th of July, the speech must represent a dialogue between the nation's past on the one hand and its present and future on the other. In this task, Douglass confronts a serious problem. To speak in the present requires a legitimate public voice, but it is precisely this legitimacy, as Douglass aimed to show, which the present enactment of the Constitution denied the African American community. So in effect, what Deacon is saying here is that Douglass actually cannot function as an epideictic orator, at least not from the point of view of the wider northern white public, because he doesn't have the legitimacy and credibility that a white orator would have in these circumstances. And so he is, by that sense, disqualified from meeting the expectations of the epideictic rhetorical situation. Douglass himself remarks on this in some ways. And as Deacon points out, again, Douglass distancing himself from his audience and his open anger at being unable to locate a present identity for himself within the national celebration of independence is thoroughly political. So the fact that Douglass comments on that is part of what makes this a political speech. Instead of following the epideictic tradition of incorporating oratory to praise the current identity or character of a function or an individual, in this case the United States, the American Revolution, the Founding Fathers, American patriotism, and the like, right? Douglass appropriates the political or deliberate, again, I think it's deliberative tradition. Douglass appropriates the political or deliberative tradition of critiquing the present to secure the future. And we certainly see that happening at certain portions, at certain passages in the Douglass speech. As Robert Fanuzzi points out, by critiquing the present hypocrisy in America and by introducing the problem of racial identity into the public scene of oratory, Douglass introduced the unthinkable, that is, the category of the subaltern, into the production of national identity. Then, of course, one of the most interesting and obvious elements of this rhetorical situation is that you have an African American orator speaking to a largely white audience and undertaking the role that is typically taken by white orators. And as Deacon points out, on the surface it would seem that the reception of Douglass as a public spectacle would have subverted his political intent by situating the audience members in the epideictic function as observers, not judges. And so the reference here to Douglass as a public spectacle would be similar in some ways to the way in which some audience members perceived the rhetorical action of Angelina Grimke. It was a public spectacle when a woman was giving a public speech, and it is likewise somewhat of a public spectacle to see especially a former slave now speaking as if he were just like a white orator. Yet, as Deacon points out, Douglass was keenly aware of his public perception as a black orator and used this position to his advantage. He saw the conventions of oratory as an occasion to reproduce racial inequality on a public stage in a public form. Douglass was able visually to reproduce this inequality because the grammar and accuracy of his sentences and the appropriateness of his elocution and gesticulation conformed, as Robert Fanuzzi points out, with a white male Republican regimen that made the physical comportment of the orator the only statement of a moral nature. This is a little complicated way, though, of saying that one of the things that Douglass does, and here we cross over into this question of irony, one of the things that Douglass does by giving the speech in the manner in which he gives it is that he actually enacts one of the chief arguments in favor of the equality of African Americans. If, as many white people in the middle of the 19th century believed, African Americans were inferior to whites, Douglass here embodies the very argument, the very rebuttal against that, because he demonstrates his ability as an African American orator, as a former slave, to meet all of the expectations, both in terms of the content of his speech, but especially in terms of his elocution and his style. He's able to meet all the expectations of an ordinary white orator, and even indeed to surpass them in many ways. So then we get to one of the chief objectives of the Douglass speech, and as Deacon points out, Douglass enacted the elite presence of the classically trained white rhetorician and accepted the premise of Republican oratory only to articulate a national identity for himself and his race in ways his audience would not have expected. Indeed, one of the most compelling aspects of the Douglass speech is to observe how he uses the epidictic occasion to deliver a message which at one level is not only surprising, but indeed could be considered inappropriate or inconsistent with the expectations of his audience. But he uses that opportunity to advance the moral argument about slavery. The inconsistency really, the irony really, is on the part of American citizens who are celebrating liberty and freedom on Independence Day, even as millions of African Americans are held in bondage in the southern states. And so that needs to be pointed out. So Douglass chooses a rhetorical strategy to do that. His imposing presence, not merely his discourse, was what he wished his audience to receive. For in his 4th of July address, he makes it clear that the power of language alone is not enough to remedy the evils of American slavery. So you can't have a polite, well-crafted or well-manicured style of address. Douglass says a different strategy is needed. Oh, had I the ability and could reach the nation's ear, Douglass says, I would today pour out a fiery stream of biting ridicule, blasting reproach, withering sarcasm, and stern rebuke. For it is not light that is needed, but fire. It is not the gentle shower, but thunder. We need the storm, the whirlwind, and the earthquake. And then, of course, at another level, isn't it ironic that it's Frederick Douglass, a former slave, an African American, who has to point this out? It's not the sons and daughters, it's not the grandchildren of the American revolutionaries who are pointing out the inconsistencies between the Declaration of Independence and the institution of slavery, but they have to be reminded about this by a former slave. So let's take a look then at the Douglass speech, and we'll try to go back to some of those questions that we raised and point out some of the places and the passages in the speech where these questions may be answered. So opening the address, Douglass, in a kind of conventional way, sort of apologizes for his inability to meet the occasion. We might think back to Thomas Jefferson's first inaugural, where Jefferson has that great expression of humility. And so in part, that's what Douglass is gesturing here. He says, "He who could address this audience without a quailing sensation has stronger nerves than I have. I do not remember ever to have appeared as a speaker before any assembly more shrinkingly, nor with greater distrust of my ability than I do this day. A feeling has crept over me quite unfavorable to the exercise of my limited powers of speech. The task before me is one which requires much previous thought and study for its proper performance. I know that apologies of this sort are generally considered flat and unmeaning. I trust, however, that mine will not be so considered. Should I seem at ease, my appearance would much misrepresent me. The little experience I have had in addressing public meetings in country schoolhouses avails me nothing on the present occasion." So as we said, in one way, this is a kind of conventional expression of humility at the opening of the address, but it is at the same time the first indication that Douglass is going to use irony as a principal trope. He's talking here about distrusting his ability and having limited powers of speech and having little experience in addressing public meetings. But of course, it's 1852, and Douglass has been a public speaker, and primarily a public speaker, for about 11 years. He's been speaking on the topic of slavery, even taking a tour in Great Britain and Ireland to talk about slavery, a speaking tour where he spoke to audiences 2 or 3 times a day. So he has a good deal of ability. I think most Americans would think Frederick Douglass was one of the best orators in America at the time. And so he's speaking ironically here about his limited abilities. It is a conventional opening, but at the same time, we recognize there's something more going on than what the words seem to indicate. And he continues this into the next paragraph. "The fact is, ladies and gentlemen, the distance between this platform and the slave plantation from which I escaped is considerable, and the difficulties to be overcome in getting from the latter to the former are by no means slight. That I am here today is to me a matter of astonishment as well as of gratitude. You will not therefore be surprised if, in what I have to say, I evince no elaborate preparation, nor grace my speech with any high-sounding exordium. With little experience and with less learning, I have been able to throw my thoughts hastily and imperfectly together, and trusting to your patient and generous indulgence, I will proceed to lay them before you." So again, we would not expect an orator to focus on the distinctions or difference or distance, as he does here, between he and his audience, but he does that, of course, to make a point that he is, in fact, a former slave. He escaped from slavery. He is black. Most of them are white. There is a difference. And so he wants to remark on that, indeed, as a way to embody or enact one of those strong rebuttals against the inferiority of blacks versus whites. And so while he says, "I evince no elaborate preparation," anyone who's read the speech knows, indeed, it must have been a lot of effort in preparation. It's a well-crafted speech. It seems, again, probably just conventional form that he says he's been able to throw his thoughts hastily and imperfectly together, because, again, as you read the speech, you see there's a very clear structure and argument and set of appeals developed, and it all seems carefully and properly put together. So then we turn to the portion of the speech where Douglass exhibits his understanding of the generic constraints associated with the 4th of July oration. He says, for instance, I am not wanting in respect for the fathers of this republic. The signers of the Declaration of Independence were brave men. They were great men, too, great enough to give fame to a great age. It does not often happen to a nation to raise at one time such a number of truly great men. The point from which I am compelled to view them is not certainly the most favorable, and yet I cannot contemplate their great deeds with less than admiration. They were statesmen, patriots, and heroes, and for the good they did and the principles they contended for, I will unite with you to honor their memory. And so in this passage and in others as well, we can see that Douglass is in fact he's answering the obligations of an epidictic orator. He's doing what is expected of them, praising the founding fathers, praising their great deeds, calling them patriots and heroes, securing their fame, honoring their memory, all of these things, as we've learned, especially when we looked at the Daniel Webster eulogy to Adams and Jefferson, all of these things that we associate with epidictic performance. And yet we also see then that Douglass has a clear familiarity with the occasion, with the expectations and the generic constraints. He signals that here only in some ways so he can turn it on its head and then use the occasion to in fact criticize America and its celebration of liberty and freedom in the midst of slavery. And then we have this beautiful passage, which we'll spread out across 2 slides here, where Douglass takes the principles of the Revolution and turns them back against the members of his audience who are celebrating Independence Day. He challenges them, in effect, to live up to the principles and the example of the Founding Fathers. But your fathers, who had not adopted the fashionable idea of this day of the infallibility of government and the absolute character of its acts, presumed to differ from the home government in respect to the wisdom and the justice of some of those burdens and restraints. They went so far in their excitement as to pronounce the measures of government unjust, unreasonable, and oppressive, and altogether such as ought not to be quietly submitted to. I scarcely need say, fellow citizens, that my opinion of those measures fully accords with that of your fathers. Such a declaration of agreement on my part would not be worth much to anybody. It would certainly prove nothing as to what part I might have taken had I lived during the great controversy of 1776. To say now that America was right and England wrong is exceedingly easy. Everybody can say it. The dastard, not less than the noble brave, can flippantly descant on the tyranny of England towards the American colonies. It is fashionable to do so. But there was a time when to pronounce against England and in favor of the cause of the colonies tried men's souls. They who did so were accounted in their day plotters of mischief, agitators and rebels, dangerous men. To side with the right against the wrong, with the weak against the strong, and with the oppressed against the oppressor, here lies the merit, and the one which of all others seems unfashionable in our day. The cause of liberty may be stabbed by the men who glory in the deeds of your fathers. And so what Douglass is doing, he's taking the occasion, the epidictic occasion of Independence Day, and he is saying to the sons and daughters, the grandchildren of the Founding Fathers, he's saying to them, don't just celebrate the sentiments and the ideas of the Declaration of Independence. Anybody today can say America was right and England was wrong. Rather, follow the example of the Founding Fathers. That is, side with the right against the wrong and the weak against the strong. Be accounted today as plotters of mischief, agitators, and rebels, as the Founding Fathers were. And of course, what Douglass is doing here in this passage is he's describing the abolitionists. He's describing the way most people in America, including even the people in the northern states, it's the way most people thought about the abolitionists. They were plotters of mischief, agitators and rebels, dangerous men. And so Douglass is saying, there lies the merit. That is, be willing to courageously oppose what you know to be wrong and do it in your day, even though it's unfashionable.
And then Douglass turns to offer his audience a more direct challenge, a more direct confrontation with the inconsistencies between Independence Day and slavery, and in particular with the invitation to a former slave to be the one who, with his oratory, celebrates national independence.
Fellow citizens, pardon me. Allow me to ask, why am I called upon to speak here today? What have I, or those I represent, to do with your national independence? Are the great principles of political freedom and of natural justice embodied in that Declaration of Independence extended to us? And am I, therefore, called upon to bring our humble offering to the national altar and to confess the benefits and express devout gratitude for the blessings resulting from your independence to us? So notice here again, just as he expressed the distance and distinction and disparity between him and his audience, he is here saying, I don't identify with the celebration of the 4th of July. I don't celebrate Independence Day. I can't, and neither can the slaves, whose voice in a sense I am, says Douglass. We cannot celebrate your national independence. This is your holiday. It's the holiday for white Americans. It's not something to be celebrated by African Americans, whether free and living in the North or enslaved and living in the South. So as we see Douglass take the occasion of the 4th of July and sort of use it as an opportunity to make a powerful anti-slavery argument, it brings to mind the fact that this was actually a fairly common approach for abolitionist orators. And I take, for example, just a paragraph from a Dover, New Hampshire minister who was an abolitionist and who spoke on the 4th of July both in Dover and in Somersworth, or what was called then Great Falls, New Hampshire, in 1838. So Enoch Mack says, the clank of chains on inoffensive human limbs we hear, responsive to the cannon's roar and loud huzzah for liberty. This day there rises to our ears the horrid clangor of rattling chains upon the limbs of thousands, hundreds of thousands, 10,000,000, twice, yea, thrice 10,000,000 of our own countrymen, and so on. So again, other orators before Douglass had done this. Douglass's is especially eloquent attempt at using the occasion, but the idea that there was hypocrisy or the idea that there was a contradiction between the celebration of the 4th of July and the institution of slavery in America was not new with Douglass. It was, again, another tradition within abolition that Douglass himself was participating in. So Douglass says, in a similar way that Enoch Mack had done, I say, with a sad sense of the disparity between us, I am not included within the pale of this glorious anniversary. Your high independence only reveals the immeasurable distance between us. The blessings in which you this day rejoice are not enjoyed in common. The rich inheritance of justice, liberty, prosperity, and independence bequeathed by your fathers is shared by you, not by me. The sunlight that brought life and healing to you has brought stripes and death to me. This 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice. I must mourn. To drag a man in fetters into the grand illuminated temple of liberty and call upon him to join you in joyous anthems were inhuman mockery and sacrilegious irony. Do you mean, citizens, to mock me by asking me to speak today? And so again, think about this when you go to watch a speech or listen to a speech. One of the things that members of an audience want to be able to do is to identify with the orator. You want to be able to follow the arguments. You want those appeals to resonate. You want to feel connected to the orator. And Douglass is giving the audience here lots of reasons why that cannot happen. It is perhaps most obvious in his embodied contradiction as a former slave speaking on the 4th of July about the institution of slavery, but he emphasizes it here too in his words. And so he turns then directly and explicitly to address the problem of American slavery. My subject then, fellow citizens, is American slavery. I shall see this day and its popular characteristics from the slave's point of view. And this kind of reminds us that Douglass, as now an escaped slave, free and living in the northern states, is in some sense a voice. He's the embodied voice of all of the millions of slaves still held in bondage in the southern states. And so he says on behalf of them and from their point of view, standing there identified with the American bondman, making his wrongs mine, I do not hesitate to declare with all my soul that the character and conduct of this nation never looked blacker to me than on this 4th of July. Whether we turn to the declarations of the past or to the professions of the present, the conduct of the nation seems equally hideous and revolting. America is false to the past, false to the present, and solemnly binds herself to be false to the future. Standing with God and the crushed and bleeding slave on this occasion, I will, in the name of humanity which is outraged, in the name of liberty which is fettered, in the name of the Constitution and the Bible which are disregarded and trampled upon, dare to call in question and to denounce with all the emphasis I can command everything that serves to perpetuate slavery, the great sin and shame of America. So again, this is not the message most people would expect on an Independence Day oration. And Douglass, however, uses the occasion to point out the especial hypocrisy of America on such an occasion. So then we find the place where Douglass talks about argument. And the point he's bringing up here is that, as many abolitionists had pointed out, it's not really difficult to argue that slavery is wrong. That is, to argue that slavery is wrong. You can make a very logical argument, and as Douglass points out at the last sentence here, everybody knows slavery is wrong for him. But the arguments had not worked. All of the arguments in the world, all the evidence about the cruelty of slavery, all the evidence regarding the inconsistency of the institution of slavery with the ideals and principles of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, all of those arguments had failed. And so abolitionists early on, starting even in the 1830s, had instead adopted a different rhetorical approach. We saw some of this in the Angelina Grimke speech, and Douglass also exhibits some of that strategy here, because it is not argument that the anti-slavery appeal is based upon. Rather, it is feeling and sentiment and passion and sympathy. And so this is part of what Douglass is communicating here. Would you have me argue that man is entitled to liberty, that he is the rightful owner of his own body? You have already declared it. Must I argue the wrongfulness of slavery? Is that a question for Republicans? Is it to be settled by the rules of logic and argumentation as a matter beset with great difficulty, involving a doubtful application of the principle of justice, hard to be understood? How should I look today in the presence of Americans dividing and subdividing a discourse to show that men have a natural right to freedom, speaking of it relatively and positively, negatively and affirmatively? To do so would be to make myself ridiculous and to offer an insult to your understanding. There is not a man beneath the canopy of heaven that does not know that slavery is wrong for him. So it's not argument that Douglass is going to offer here, and he explains why. We have, for instance, right there in the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. There's no need for argument. The arguments have been tried, they have not worked. So Douglass offers something else. At a time like this, he says, scorching irony, not convincing argument, is needed. Oh, had I the ability and could I reach the nation's ear, I would today pour out a fiery stream of biting ridicule, blasting reproach, withering sarcasm, and stern rebuke. For it is not light that is needed, but fire. It is not the gentle shower, but thunder. We need the storm, the whirlwind, and the earthquake. The feeling of the nation must be quickened. The conscience of the nation must be roused. The propriety of the nation must be startled. The hypocrisy of the nation must be exposed, and its crimes against God and man must be proclaimed and denounced. And so indeed, this is precisely what Douglass is aiming at in this speech. He wants to quicken the feeling of the nation. He wants to rouse the national conscience. He wants to startle the nation. He wants to point out and expose the hypocrisy of the nation. And that's why he takes the occasion of the 4th of July speech to do that. So here then we arrive at what we might call the thesis of the Douglass speech. That is the main or central idea, where he asks the question that gives us the title of the speech. What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all other days in the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham, your boasted liberty an unholy license, your national greatness swelling vanity. Your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless, your denunciations of tyrants brass-fronted impudence, your shouts of liberty and equality hollow mockery, your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings with all your religious parade and solemnity are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy, a thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages. There is not a nation on the earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of these United States at this very hour. Now, of course, if you're in the audience, even if you're an abolitionist in the audience, this was probably a shocking passage to hear. It's certainly not expected in the occasion of a 4th of July oration. And it's not the way Americans want to hear themselves described, whether on this occasion or any time. And then Douglass offers what we could describe as maybe the most typical abolitionist passage of the speech, a graphic description, in this case, of the slave trade. Again, we talked about how abolitionists had more or less given up the idea of arguing against slavery. They had tried that. The arguments seemed obvious. They seem obvious to us now, and yet the arguments changed nothing. And yet to startle the nation, as Douglass said, right? To rouse their conscience, to quicken their feelings. He uses, as many abolitionists did, graphic descriptions of the cruelty of slavery, We saw this with Angelina Grimke. We saw it certainly in the book that Angelina Grimke wrote with her husband Theodore Weld, American Slavery as It Is. This was the approach that the abolitionists took. It was the way in which they described slavery that left you only with the option of responding emotionally. So again, we can go back to the Fisher-Ames speech, and we think of the way in which Ames described the cruel Indian attacks on settlers on the frontier, and how he wanted the members of the House of Representatives to feel sympathy for those settlers. Here again, the same kind of passionate rhetoric is used, a graphic description which we then respond to emotionally and make a moral judgment based on that sentiment. Douglass says, "There, see the old man with locks thinned and gray. Cast one glance, if you please, upon that young mother whose shoulders are bare to the scorching sun, her briny tears falling on the brow of the babe in her arms. See, too, that girl of 13, weeping, yes, weeping, as she thinks of the mother from whom she has been torn. The drove moves tardily. Heat and sorrow have nearly consumed their strength. Suddenly you hear a quick snap, like the discharge of a rifle. The fetters clank, and the chain rattles simultaneously. Your ears are saluted with a scream that seems to have torn its way to the center of your soul. The crack you heard was the sound of the slave whip. The scream you heard was from the woman you saw with the babe. Her speed had faltered under the weight of her child and her chains. That gash on her shoulder tells her to move on." So again, this in some ways has that kind of echo of that Fisher-Ames passage in the Jay Treaty speech. And we did note that Douglass read the Columbian Orator. He was familiar with the Ames speech. But we also see here Douglass relying not just on a graphic description of the horrible slave trade, but a description that requires of us that we use all of our senses. We see the old man. We feel the scorching sun. We can even taste the briny tears, right? So all of our senses are engaged, and our imagination creates this scene in our mind, which we then have to respond to emotionally and judge morally. And then we get this final passage that I want to focus on, where Douglass sort of summarizes the key problem on the 4th of July in 1852. The existence of slavery in this country brands your republicanism as a sham, your humanity as a base pretense, and your Christianity as a lie. It destroys your moral power abroad. It corrupts your politicians at home. It saps the foundation of religion. It makes your name a hissing and a byword to a mocking earth. It is the antagonistic force in your government, the only thing that seriously disturbs and endangers your union. It fetters your progress. It is the enemy of improvement, the deadly foe of education. It fosters pride. It breeds insolence. It promotes vice. It shelters crime. It is a curse to the earth that supports it. And yet you cling to it as if it were the sheet anchor of all your hopes. Oh, be warned, a horrible reptile is coiled up in your nation's bosom. The venomous creature is nursing at the tender breast of your youthful republic. For the love of God, tear away and fling from you the hideous monster, and let the weight of 20 millions crush and destroy it forever. So this is perhaps the most famous abolitionist speech given by one of the most famous abolitionists, certainly the most famous of the black abolitionists, and one of the greatest orators of the 19th century, Frederick Douglass. So it's a very compelling and interesting speech, usually one of the favorites in the class when I've taught this before. And if you have further comments or questions about the Frederick Douglass speech, What to the Slave is the 4th of July, please feel free to post your questions or comments on the discussion board.